morning. If you're all ready, we're ready to start punctually, or almost 100% punctually. We have a wonderful opening for this morning. We have a wonderful research project in progress that it will be discussed and described for us by 3 doctoral students from the University of Munich, participating in the research project Juden im mittelalterlichen Regensburg, conducted at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität in Munich and headed by Professor Dr. Eva Haferkamp. This is an interdisciplinary endeavor to uncover and reconstruct the history of the Jews of Regensburg in the Middle Ages, with a special emphasis on the period between 1350 and the expulsion in 1519. The vantage points of the study cover a social, political, economic, and religious history of the city and of the regional bishopric of Regensburg. The initial stage of the project will be a digitized presentation of the collected material, which will be launched at the Corpus der Quellen zur Geschichte der Juden im spätmittelalterlichen Reich, corpus of sources on the history of the Jews in the Reich in the Middle Ages, and only later will it be published in a printed form. Findings from the medieval quarter of Regensburg, situated... Sorry, that's my cell phone. I'm sorry, I forgot to turn it off. It's probably Professor Haferkamp wishing you all good luck. I'm sure. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Yes, Haferkamp.
רק תלחץ בצד שמאל למעלה. Okay, thank you. Findings from the medieval quarter of Regensburg, situated in today's Neupfarrplatz, have been uncovered by a team headed by Professor Dr. Bernd Pefken of the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität between 1995 and 1998. The results of this study will be part of the same project. The unique juxtaposition of archival material and archaeological finds will offer a founded reconstruction of the Jewish quarter of Regensburg. We're all waiting to the publication. We have here, as we often do in our Goren Goldstein Center, younger scholars. You're no longer young scholars. We heard you in Paris. You gave 3 wonderful presentations, so we're all looking forward to what you have to say. The first lecturer is Astrid Riedler-Pohlers from the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität in Munich. They all are there, so I'll skip that later. In summer 2011, she received her master's degree in medieval history, writing on Jüdische Ärzte im Spätmittelalter im süddeutschen Raum, insbesondere in Bayern, Jewish physicians in the late Middle Ages in southern Germany, especially in Bavaria, under the supervision of Professor Dr. Eva Haferkamp. After a parental leave, she began working on a doctoral thesis in 2013. The title of her awaited dissertation is Spätmittelalterliche Heilkundige in süddeutschem Raum, Juden und Christen in Vergleich, Jewish and Christian physicians in medieval Regensburg, late medieval Regensburg, under the supervision of Professor Dr. Eva Haferkamp. Within the framework of the research project Juden im mittelalterlichen Regensburg, she's working since 2013 on archival sources on the topography of the Jewish quarter in late medieval Regensburg, and today she will present her presentation on archival sources regarding house purchases in the Jewish quarter. The floor is yours. Thank you. Okay.
This is a map of the city of Regensburg. The Jewish quarter in Regensburg was very central in location. It was situated inside the ancient Roman settlement area, and during the expansion of the town during the Middle Ages, the quarter came to be part of the Regensburg core city center. Today, little of the old Jews' Lane, or Judengasse as it was termed, remains visible. Today, this area is occupied by the new parish square, or Neupfarrplatz, where a documentation center and a replica of the foundation walls of the former synagogue are reminders of the old Jewish quarter. Although we have a good basic notion of the location of this quarter during the medieval period, to date there has been scant exact research, aside from a few exceptions, on the extent to which Jewish settlement extended out beyond the perimeter of the Jews' Lane. Previous research postulated that the Judengasse was a self-contained area surrounded by a wall. Today we know that was not the case, although there is evidence that there were indeed gates in the outer perimeter of the quarter. However, those gates were possible to lock from the inside, for example to ensure peace and quiet in the quarter on high holidays or other festive days. I will attempt here to reconstruct the Jewish quarter to its fullest extent, utilizing archival sources that are stored inter alia in various holdings in the Bavarian Central State Archive in Munich. Of principal interest is the location of the individual houses, but I also examine the residents, sellers and buyers of these structures. All the sources that provide information in some way on the location of the buildings under Jewish ownership or possession are collated and ordered chronologically. A distinction is made between property owned and self-utilized and a possibly temporary possession of a structure that was transferred to a Jewish possession by means of lien or pawn. Such possession by Jews of pawn property can also have been located outside the perimeter of the Jewish quarter. What sources provide data regarding the location of the houses? Sources where it is important to know what particular specific house is involved will doubtless give us the most detailed information. Such sources include documents of sale, hypothecations involving a pawn property, matters of rental payment, and also legal disputes, such as entitlement to utilize a cellar or the construction of a wall or its extension in height. Such documents name not only the parties involved, but sometimes also the previous owners, rates of lease rental, sales prices, modalities of payment, and much else. Especially useful for the present investigation are references regarding the exact location of the houses. But since the so-called Judengasse does not designate a single street, but rather an entire quarter, information is often included regarding buildings bordering on or opposite to the property. Such data make it easier to generate a sketch and also help in determining what the neighboring realities were, at least topographically, depending on the specific structure discussed in the source. Let us now turn an eye to the current situation. In the 1990s, as part of the renovation of New Parish Square, Neupfarrplatz, the top surface of the soil there was removed. This brought to light the remains of walls and cellar walls that called for a detailed archaeological investigation. Subsequently, between 1995 and 1998, the Neupfarrplatz was excavated and the finds were documented. It proved possible to reconstruct the location of numerous houses in the former Jewish quarter with great accuracy. This is helpful for evaluating the archival materials. On the other hand, the excavations alone shed only limited light in regard to identifying the residents and their possessions. For one, most of the finds are still awaiting a scientific evaluation. Second, based on the finds, one cannot necessarily deduce a specific occupational activity from them. Certainly, in the case of a goldsmith, for example, that may be possible, such as when remainders of gold have been found. Likewise, constructional realities at a site can strongly suggest a former bakery. But when it comes to merchants or a simple residential house, it is difficult to make any conclusions about the users or residents from the finds. For that reason, it is particularly necessary and important here to combine archaeology and archive, that is to say, the analysis of the archival materials, and that is an aim of my investigations. Thus, using the excavations and what they tell us, a site plan was generated allowing the historian to transpose data from the documentary sources to this site plan. It is simpler to determine the location of a house at intersections or corner points. Especially in this area, an archaeological plan is an indispensable aid in reconstructing an area which surface is destroyed. There have been previous attempts to reconstruct the Jewish quarter, but these were often beset by various errors. Thus, for example, Adolf Schmitt, who in the 1930s made an important contribution to such research, failed to distinguish between sources from the 9th century and the 15th. This is a further reason for a renewed attempt to reconstruct the former Jewish quarter on the basis of new source material. Moving now on to the main topic, the reconstruction of the Jewish quarter, let's look at a modern map at the city in order to get some idea of the perimeter of the location of the Jewish quarter. Here is the Neupfarrplatz. The Residenzstraße leads nowadays to the area of the cathedral. The Dreihelmgasse goes off to the east. In the south, the Pfarrplatz is bordered by Gesandtenstraße, and in the west by Tendlergasse. Nor should we forget the so-called Kramwinkel in the northwest area. These are the rough boundaries of Neupfarrplatz, mirrored onto a modern street map. If this area is also identical with the extensions of the Jewish quarter, is a core question of my research today. A reconstructed map indicates the old names that were already in use at the time of the late medieval Judengasse. Please note that in this map, south is up and north is down below. Important here in particular are again the Kramwinkel, the side street under Heibad, today's Residenzstraße, and the Spielhof. The side streets up above today have totally different names or are no longer in existence. In this area, the street names indicate different kinds of artisanship. Important for my presentation is especially the area Undansporan. This refers to a special sub-area of the craft of the locksmith or metalworker, artisans known as sporer, who crafted spurs for body armor, that is to say spur makers. Perhaps you're wondering why I only use a current city map and a map which reconstructs the situation of the streets in 1470. In the case of Regensburg, we only have city maps available from roughly 1600 on, which unfortunately are of no use here since the Jewish quarter was largely demolished and destroyed after the expulsion of the Jews in 1519. Now I would like to turn to looking more closely at the sources that can provide some data on the location of the houses. Here the chronology of the sources and the temporal distribution are of specific importance. Basically, the location of the Jewish quarter remained unchanged over the course of centuries, but the actual boundaries and the property relations could change repeatedly. In addition, we shouldn't necessarily assume that the utilization of a building always remained the same. The sources I selected for this talk are from the years 1350 to 1384. First, let's look a bit closer at the gates I mentioned earlier. Although there was no wall around the Jewish quarter, we assume actual several gates. If one looks at the entry points to the quarter, the following possibilities emerge. Of these possible gates, one today can be verified locally in situ, namely between Kramwinkel and Tendlergasse. In a source from 1383, another one of these gates is mentioned. The Jews Sadion, Gnendel and David hereby confirm, representing the community as a whole, that Stephan der Thündorfer gave them 6 shillings of the long Regensburg penny and 1 pound pepper of eternal validity, rent. Quote, from the house in the courtyard below it, located in Regensburg, among us Jews, directly at our Jews' gate at the Heubad, across from the cathedral priory, which until then belonged to Joseph from Abensburg and now belongs to Abraham, the Jew from Nuremberg. Close quote. The first expression that strikes the eye is unter uns Juden, among us Jews. It refers directly to the Judengasse, that is to say, the house in question is located inside the quarter. Let's look once more at the map. Here above is the cathedral, opposite is the Heubad, and this corner house is the cathedral priory. The gate mentioned here must have been roughly located at this spot. So this house was in 1383 the property of the Jew Joseph, and when this document was issued, it belonged to Abraham from Nuremberg. This was probably one of the houses on the margin of the quarter and bordering its northeastern corner. In addition, a source from 1384 is evidential for a third gate. That year, David and his housewife Plümel handed over the house to the municipal council as a pawn and guarantee, quote, that is located among the Jews of Regensburg, near the gate, opposite the Sporer, spur makers. Close quote. As mentioned before, the name referred to a section of Locksmith Lane. The gate in question probably was located here down below. Future research will show to what extent further gates can be established on the basis of archival research. A further type of source is a listing of the houses of Jews from the years 1350-51. It contains data on a total of 39 houses, and some 20 of these provide information on their location. Looking at the list more carefully, one can note that the mentioned houses must have been included according to their position in the row of houses. The list states frequently the next house or something similar. Aside from the location of the buildings, the list provides information about ownership particulars. The following line from the list is of great interest for the present study, since the house is not directly located where it has previously been assumed that the Jewish quarter was situated. Quote, the new house among the spur makers belongs to Schmitt, a Jewish woman, and is her own house and courtyard. Close quote. The house of Schmitt the Jewess is designated as a neue house, new house, and a more precise particular on its location is also given. By means of that particular, contemporaries were doubtless able to determine precisely which house this was. Thus, the house of this Jewish woman is located among the spur makers, unter den Sporern, which is here. If you recall how the so far accepted research assumptions have demarcated the Jewish quarter, we can note that this house was located on the periphery or edge of the Regensburg Jewish quarter, if not indeed outside its perimeter. So here the question arises, was the demarcation as previously sketched actually correct, or why did this specific Jewish woman possess a house outside the core area of the Jewish quarter? Two further particulars from this list are of special interest. They refer to the Jew Nachman, who is mentioned in another source as well. The Jew Nachman gives nothing, gives no rent, from the entire Spielhof. All courtyards and houses are his estate. Eisal, who lives directly next door to Nachman, gives nothing, gives no rent, from the house and courtyard, it is his own. These two lines stand in this sequence in the list. Nachman appears to have been a very important and wealthy Jew, since he apparently owned several houses, as one can see, alles eigen Hofstadt und Häuser, all courtyards and houses are his estate. Mention of the Spielhof designates the location of the properties more precisely. I will return shortly to Nachman's property as well as to the location of Eisal's house that was located right next door to Nachman's. Let's keep these particulars in mind when we try after the next source to draw a sketch of this area of the Jewish quarter. The aforementioned Nachman, owner of several houses, as is clear from the list, is mentioned in a sales document of Lautwein dem Löwel, provost in Regensburg, and describes the location of his house more precisely. Although this is not Jewish property to be sold, this source is of great utility for demarcating more exactly the boundaries of the former Jewish quarter. Quote, I, Lautwein der Löwel, provost in Regensburg, my wife and heirs, report and declare to all those who see this letter or to whom it is read aloud that we sell our own house, located in the Spielhof, bordering directly on the Jew's house which belonged at that time to the Nachman the Jew, and which borders on the orchard of the church district, decanate of St. John, together with the courtyard below and the entire stonework adjoining the house, which Friedrich the bladesmith has now purchased, together with the smithy that opens out into the Spielhof. Close quote. So here we have a number of particulars that permit us to locate the house more precisely. We know it is a house located in the Spielhof. This borders directly on the house of the Jew Nachman. In addition, it is adjoining the orchard of the decanate of St. John, with courtyard and stonework. And this in turn abuts on the house of the bladesmith, whose smithy opens out into the Spielhof. If we recall the source we discussed earlier, then 2 more particulars can be added that must be taken into account. Nachman is the owner of several houses in the Spielhof, and Eisal's house adjoins one of the properties owned by Nachman. The sketch refers to this area around the Spielhof. Another possible location is down here, as these houses belonged also to the Spielhof. Since the 2 document sources are separated by just 2 years, it is legitimate to combine the particulars given therein in order to extract the great possible value from these sources. We have no indication to date that Jews settled out and back of this point. So this would be the eastern boundary of the quarter with this row of houses. The house of the Jewish woman Hatzmitten alludes to and also questions a boundary line of the quarter at its southeastern corner. The Hatzmitten's house would have been here, in this area. Later I want to say something more about the southern area of the quarter. Some brief remarks are now in order regarding a key building for the Jewish community, the synagogue. The Jewish quarter was very centrally located. The synagogue was on one of Regensburg's most important commercial streets, and today its location is beyond dispute. But unlike in other Jewish quarters of that day, it was not situated at the center of the quarter, but rather in a highly visible spot, namely in close proximity to the Christian houses on the commercial street mentioned, right across from the Augustinian monastery. In the west, there is evidence from a very early source that this house was once a Jewish hospital. In addition, a house sale document from 1371 indicates another neighborhood between a Jew and a Christian. This is mentioned at the occasion of the selling of the house of David and his wife. Quote, I, David the Jew, my housewife and all our heirs, Jews in Regensburg, report and do herewith declare to all those who can look at or read the letter that we, in united goodwill, have given our own house with the courtyard, which is situated to the west, and opposite the house of the Nestelbrunner, from which an annual rental payment of 25 pennies of Regensburg coinage is provided to the church in Obermünster in Regensburg, together with the title of ownership to the Honorable Christian Filzer. Close quote. The house whose sale is specified in this document is located in this area of the Jewish quarter. It can be assumed that David's house was located somewhere in the extension of the Tendlergasse. Correspondingly, the house would have been directly opposite that of the Nestelbrunner. You can see here a direct neighborly connection between Jews and Christians who probably shared a joint interior courtyard and thus most likely also the latrine. Similar constellations can certainly also be expected in other districts on the boundary or perimeter of the quarter. I have discussed 3 boundary areas of the Judengasse. Let me return now to the southern boundary of the Jewish quarter. Here the investigation is especially difficult. On the one hand, we have to date not yet found the archival sources for this area. On the other, the new parish church has constituted a major standing obstacle for the archaeological investigations. Moreover, the excavations were only conducted until that point, and no further. On the basis of the structural building material brought to light, the archaeologists assume that there must have been a closed row of houses in this area, which may have served as a boundary for the southern side of the Jewish quarter. However, since we lack the archival sources, it has been impossible so far to determine if the houses were owned by Christians or Jews. As has been seen, these are fragments of a kind of puzzle, pieces that can gradually be assembled into a whole. In order to obtain more information on the houses, it is not only necessary to comb through the holdings in search of precise sources, such as documents on a house sale. As the source regarding David and Nestelbrunner has indicated, the extant materials that appear to refer to the surrounding Christian residential houses also need to be taken into account. It is possible, for example, that the sources on the Christian houses here, in this area, also contain references to neighboring houses owned by Jews. For the Jewish quarter in particular, the further sources pertaining to the individuals previously mentioned will be included in the extended future analysis in order to establish the individual's position, occupation and standing. and thus be able to better determine the ownership and property situation in the Jewish quarter. After looking through all the sources concerning the Jewish community, at the end of the project, it should be possible to calculate a more accurate figure for the number of the Jews resident in late medieval Regensburg. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. We could see the documents come to life in the ground plan of the city and the Jewish quarter. It's wonderful. Our next speaker is Sophia Schmitt, also at the same university. In 2014, she received her master's degree in medieval history, ancient history, and Latin at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität in Munich, participating in a research project on the Jews in medieval Regensburg. She then began working on her PhD thesis titled Ritual Murder Allegations in Networks, Jews and Christians in Southern Germany in the second half of the 15th century, which is supervised by Professor Dr. Eva Haferkamp. Her dissertation focuses on the ritual murder allegations of Regensburg, but includes other accusations in the area as well. Currently, she's receiving a doctoral scholarship from the Gerda Henkel Foundation, something to be jealous of course. Her topic today is a perception of the Jewish quarter as a social and spatial entity at the time of the ritual murder accusation. Please, enlighten us.
Evaluating the situation of a Jewish quarter in any medieval town, it is best to look first at its specific location within the town. This kind of visualization, however, should not lead to perceiving the Jewish quarter right from the outset as a single unitary block with insurmountable barriers separated off from the other parts of town. Instead, it is more appropriate to focus on the streets as channels of communication and to see how closely the Jewish quarter was actually situated to important municipal institutions. In this way, the quarter will be understood as an integral part of the town. While for a long time the idea predominated that in the German Empire of the 14th and 15th century, Jews were being ever more pressured to live in secluded and ghettoized areas, in the meanwhile, a more differentiated discussion on this topic has emerged in research. Its approach considers the development of diverse situations in different towns. For example, while the City Council of Frankfurt in 1462 forced the Frankfurt Jews to leave their district in the center of the city and move to the periphery to live in a secluded narrow lane or ghetto, the City Council of Cologne, by contrast, tried to convince the Jews in the city to reduce the barriers around their quarter, rendering it thus easier to pass through. These examples indicate that such a mode of separation could occur under quite diverse premises and conditions. Therefore, it would also have been perceived differently. In my talk today, I will concentrate on the question of contemporary perception. Was the Jewish quarter regarded as a spatial entity closed off from the rest of the city? In the late medieval sources available, that are institutional sources, namely those of the City Council, there are scarcely any direct statements referring to this. In order to attempt approaching the notion of how the quarter was perceived, two aspects will be combined below. First, sources are examined that present reactions to an exceptional state of affairs for the Jewish quarter. Through the prism of deviation from the normal, a sense of spatial recognition of the quarter and its normal situation can be constructed. The exceptional state of affairs that I will explore here arises during the allegation of ritual murder brought against several members of the Regensburg Jewish community. First mentioned in a confession made during the ritual murder trial in Trent in 1475, the Regensburg City Council decided to pursue this allegation further and accused and imprisoned 16 Jews. From the end of March, the entire Jewish quarter was placed under house arrest. Pressured by Emperor Frederick III, who demanded the release and handover of the imprisoned Jews, the Regensburg municipal authorities decided to lift the house arrest on the Jewish quarter in August 1476. However, the Jews accused of ritual murder remained in jail. An intensive juridical dispute developed between the emperor and the city about the legal jurisdiction over the Jews of Regensburg. In 1480, the city had to release the imprisoned Jews and was required to pay a substantial penalty to the emperor. The house arrest that was ordered in the course of these events and the quarter's blockade from the outside were mentioned frequently in the early sources on the ritual murder accusation. It led to an exceptional state of physical segregation for the Jewish quarter and its community. I wish to connect this disturbance caused by the construction of a physical space to a second concept, namely the constitution of space through social interaction, following the paradigm of space developed in the so-called spatial turn. As spatial entities are understood in a relational context, they are not per se bound to physical barriers of any kind. Space is used as a perspective and a measure of perception, well beyond its material and topographical dimension. This expanded concept of space as a category of analysis presents the opportunity to observe the construction of space on different levels, as well as the appropriation and use of space, and thus its perception. In this approach, it is necessary to take into consideration not only the Jewish quarter, but the entire town in order to recognize different constellations of space. So, as a first step exploring the relationship between physical and relational space, I will examine the house arrest imposed on the Regensburg Jewish community more closely. The city council planned the following measures to be enforced. Quote, all Jews who have confessed to it should be imprisoned and their possessions should be requisitioned and seized, and the other Jews who are not imprisoned should be closed off within the Judengassen, both physically and with their possessions, and placed under house arrest. The imprisoned Jews should be questioned about whether they might not point to the guilt of some other Jew not yet imprisoned. End of quote. Initially, this procedure aimed to prevent the Jews of Regensburg from leaving the city in an attempt to escape prosecution. However, this explanation soon loses its validity because after the emperor's intervention, the imprisoned Jews were no longer questioned or tortured, so further accusations against other Jews on their part could not be expected. Moreover, the statement mentions explicitly the Jews' property, prohibiting that it might be brought outside the quarter. This concerns sales and pawnbroking, but also everyday provisioning and errands. In another source, the city council emphasizes that it was still providing for the Jews by, quote, allowing a merchant and a butcher to go in and out of the quarter, end of quote. Hence, entering the quarter was likewise restricted. The focus here is not a complete blockade, but the municipal authorities' demonstration of their control and exercise of supremacy over the Jewish community. In cases where the city expected an advantage to accrue for them, they would permit exceptions to their rule, as the following source demonstrates. Quote, with this, also a group of Jews are ordered to buy food for the Jews under house arrest, and then to bring food to the imprisoned Jews. Some fellows are commanded to go with them. End of quote. By relying on the support of those who were actually supposed to stay in their quarter, the city could reduce its expenses. For practical reasons, here the city was satisfied with a situation we might call controlled permeability of the physical barrier. Likewise, with regard to the pawns that were stored by the Jews, the city had to rely on Jewish help. Therefore, it was determined that the redemption of pawns should be carried out by a member of the city council acting together with a Jew. Quote, each the imprisoned Jews should get their food their women brought. If someone wants to redeem a pawn, it can only take place in the presence of Hans Frauenberger or Hans von Deggenberg or Erhard Mucha. A Jew should come with them as well. End of quote. The frequent mention of problems with redemption of pawns, shown by orders like the one above, or statements like, quote, "The Jews have still not provided a Jew for the redemption of the pawns," end of quote, indicates that it was very significant for the council to maintain the economic space within the city, which included the Jewish quarter. The economic space was not to be destroyed by the physical segregation. To what extent, in addition to the economic relationships, social and communicative connections between the Jews of Regensburg and the Christian citizens of the town existed is more problematic to prove. Some indications can be extracted from the letter of the Jew Abraham to the city council. While he had departed, his family and possessions still remained in Regensburg. Therefore, he petitioned the council to release them, explaining that he, quote, "hopes that the honorable and wise gentlemen will see that I have never taken too high interest rates, but was rather almost ruined myself because of the citizen Huber and others. In good faith, I have pawned silver jewelry for him in his distress to lend him money. I never got back even a basic value and lost the jewelry as well, as you can learn from your court books." End of quote. Abraham asked the city authorities to grant him a favor, so he would likely try to note in his argument any aspect that seemed to him potentially strong enough to shed a positive light on his person and on his case. Hence, the association with the Christian citizen was supposed to work in his favor, so as to achieve the dissolution of the physical barrier around the quarter, at least for his family and property, as Abraham hoped. At any rate, the social contact to the outside of the quarter was actively sought. This was only possible and realistic if these connections had previously existed. From these examples, it becomes clear that the construction of the Jewish quarter as a physical entity disturbed the everyday dealings and movements in the space in which those occurred. But it also entered into competition with relational space, especially with the economic and social communicative spaces. These environments depended significantly on relationships that had been built up before the ritual murder accusation and were then damaged but not destroyed. For the Regensburg authorities, the physical creation of space remained a central factor, despite its permeability, because in emphasizing the exercise of control, they sought to utilize the space as such by argumentative appropriation. This was oriented in particular to its external impact and especially vis-à-vis the emperor. In order to undermine the critique of the emperor regarding the treatment of the Jews, the house arrest was imbued with positive connotations. In the argument of the city, the orientation of the barriers was reversed. Quote, "This crime of the Jews affects all of Christianity and troubled the common people greatly. The Regensburg City Council was worried that there would be an uprising, incited by the poor people's envy beliefs upon and other business they have with the Jews. And the Jews who are not in prison would be harmed along with their possessions and there would be looting." End of quote. How realistic this threat was at the time cannot be determined based on other sources. On the one hand, it would probably not be used as an argument if it were completely unbelievable. On the other, this idea of the quarter as a space of protection only occurs as an argument vis-à-vis the emperor. The city council used the existence of a separated space to prove their willingness to comply with the emperor's claims regarding the safety of his property, the servants of the royal chamber and their possessions. Thus, the city demonstrates the indispensable necessity of their municipal control over the situation. Otherwise, the safety of the Jews could not be guaranteed, or so they claimed. In cases where the argumentation was pointed in a different direction, the city did not hesitate to change its argumentative space. In the following source concerned with the emperor's demands for the handover of the Jews, the city affirmed that their jurisdiction also extended to the Jews of Regensburg. Quote, "When at the time of our ancestors a crime was reported, The criminal was imprisoned, and if proven guilty, the city executed their juridical power as was their custom. Be the convicted a priest or layman, a noble or a commoner, a Christian or a Jew." End of quote. The juridical space of Regensburg was therefore explained as being a unified area that extended its jurisdiction to the Jews as well. At least with regard to major offenses, the Jewish quarter was neither separated and subordinated to the Duke as the holder of the so-called Judenregal, the privilege to levy taxes and to exact jurisdiction over the Jews, nor subordinated to the emperor, who was the initial and principal holder of the Judenregal. By emphasizing the unitary character of the juridical space, the segregation of the quarter was intentionally leveled in order to demonstrate the city's exclusive responsibility for the space and accordingly the appropriation of the entire town for their own urban jurisdiction. In part of the Jewish community, argumentative usage of space can be found in some examples, such as in their lawyer's defense. Quote, "It is out of old hatred and envy that in recent years they conspire against these Jews based on void reasons." End of quote. In this manner, the urban surroundings become a united unimical counterspace with which the Jewish quarter and its inhabitants were constantly confronted. The argumentative strategy of the lawyer was to invoke the impression that the specific ritual murder accusation had been developed out of a general dislike of the Jews within the city, and not due to valid and objective allegations. The hostility was transformed from a more personal and material level to the spatial dimension. Both sides considered the Jewish quarter with its residents to be a closed space in terms of taxes. The tax claim that was part of the Judenregal had to be paid in a lump sum, while the Jewish authorities were responsible for allocating the claim among the Regensburg Jewry. Several Jews who had found a protector outside the city and were able to flee there when the accusations arose, tried to relocate their families and possessions there during the house arrest. In most cases, the city denied their request, which they justified in this way. For instance, quote, "Every Jew has to reach an agreement with the Jewry's lawyer regarding the tax claim and similar requests. If Moser of Gingen complies with the lawyer's requirements as well, his property will be released and forwarded to him." End of quote. The determination of an existing tax claim evidently lay with the Jewish community. It would not have served just as an argument vis-à-vis the protectors and the demands of their Jews, since it was in the Jewish community's own interest to keep the number of taxpayers as high as possible, resulting in a reduced burden for everyone. The affiliation as a member of this entity was determined by Christian rules and confirmed by the Jews, so that for the question of belonging to the community of the Regensburg Jewish quarter in terms of taxes to be levied, both sides would argue with the same constructions of space in favor of or against a departure. Some sources suggest that for the Christians, the physical separation was also perceived in a symbolic dimension. Proof of the Jews' guilt was sought in the quarter itself, so that its spatial dimension was actually integrated into the accusation. Quote, "Each it was investigated by searching thoroughly, and something was found, the bones of a child next to another." End of quote. So the quarter became part of the alleged crime, but at the same time it remained a kind of open-air prison. Through their affiliation to the Jewish quarter, now everyone was in a way involved in the deed the imprisoned Jews were initially accused of, or at least at any time anyone could be found guilty of complicity. Therefore, according to the original plans of the city authorities, after the release from the open-air prison, the community as a whole was to be punished by the expulsion of every Regensburg Jew. Despite the approval of a general expulsion, the city's reaction to attempts made to flee from the closed-off quarter were very severe. From this point of view, permeability was to occur only according to the city's rules. Any deviation was seen as a disruption of a mutual relation, as the wording of the following source indicates. Quote, after Abraham had first settled in our town with his wife, children, and possessions, and then left secretly without permission, we will not grant him safe conduct as it is. Regarding his spouse, we cannot understand why his wife and children claim to suffer from anything lacking." End of quote. In spite of their intervention resulting in a physical barrier, it was expected that the members of the Jewish community should continue to act within the structures established before the accusations. The city's desire for stricter control of the different modes in which the spaces, including the Jewish quarter, were constructed, has to be understood within the framework of the exceptional state of affairs in the ritual murder trial. From the point of view of the Jewish community, the relationship was seriously disturbed by the separation. The implementation of control was experienced in a very negative way and also much more severe than usual, so that Abraham now attempted to flee, whereas before, with the evidently assured relation of protection established to his protector outside the city, relocation of the entire family would have been possible. This perception shows that the accusation of ritual murder in Regensburg led to a distinct disturbance of urban space, which was most visible in the physical separation of the Jewish quarter. However, the reactions to the separation demonstrate that before the allegations, the city's relational spaces did include the Jewish quarter in many ways. The exceptional state of affairs was intensified by the symbolic meaning of the space appropriation and the argumentative adaptation of spatial structures which the city applied in reaction to the resistance against their action. The perception of the quarter from the Christian perspective was defined by a concentration on property, jurisdictional rights, and control. But it did not, as a general rule, exclude the Jewish quarter from the city. This is confirmed by the Jews' reaction. On the one hand, they tried to maintain common spaces that had been established before. On the other, they illustrate by criticism and the escapes just how much the segregation of the quarter was perceived as an exceptional state of affairs. The formation of the Jewish quarter with gates lockable from the inside, the usual physical condition of the quarter, was in general not seen as a mode of separation from the common urban space. Even in terms of argumentative appropriation, the understanding of spaces was selected, depending on a specific situation and the focus of the argument, either including or excluding the Jewish quarter. Relational structures of space extended far beyond the physical barriers, even during the exceptional state of affairs. Therefore, these relational structures of space speak in general against the notion of a clear perception of separation. On the contrary, the Jewish quarter was recognized as an integral part of the composite urban space of Regensburg. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophia. And our last speaker in this session is Veronika, also a student, or actually not so much a student, already a PhD candidate at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität in Munich. She received her BA in 2013 in Near and Middle Eastern Studies at the University in Munich, winning the highest honors. She then continued studying at the same university in the Department of History, again excelling and obtaining a master's degree already in 2014. That's 1 year apart. Since then, she is conducting research towards a PhD thesis on the expulsion of the Jews from Regensburg 1519, supervised by Professor Eva Haverkamp. She's recipient of a 2-year PhD grant awarded by the city of Regensburg. Her talk today will concentrate on violence against living and dead Jews in Regensburg at the beginning of the 16th century. The podium is yours.
Full screen mode. Okay. So, thank you very much. Thanks, Naomi. Yeah. A number of documents of the early 16th century up to the 1519 expulsion paint a picture of everyday relations between Jews and Christians in Regensburg. Apart from a few legal deeds including privileges, these are mainly large numbers of complaints and statements of claim. So the source documentation is really enormous to Regensburg. Everybody who will, who is, will know that this. We have a lot of sources. The reason for this volume derives also from an event in the city's history. At the end of the 15th century, the emperor appointed a special imperial commissioner, the Reichshauptmann, who was not only entitled to attend municipal decision-making bodies, but also had to approve all rulings passed. His main remit, however, was to reorganize the city's fundamental legal tenets concerning, for example, the clergy and the Jews. Both defended themselves with all their might against the planned ordinances directed against them and submitted complaints to Emperor Maximilian I, who in 1516 consequently appointed the Innsbruck government as the arbitration tribunal to rule on the case. The following legal proceedings between the city and the Jewish community between 1516 and the 1519 expulsion of the Jews caused a lot of suits by the Jews in the city alike. The overwhelming majority of these documents are still available in the Tyrolean Regional Archive in Innsbruck. In addition, the Bavarian State Archives in Munich hold a number of copies as well as additional documents. Also, before the beginning of the proceedings in Innsbruck in 1516, the Jews of Regensburg had submitted several complaints to the clergy, the city, the Reichshauptmann and the emperor, but above all to George, Duke of Lower Bavaria, to whom they were pledged. When the Duke died in 1503, his rights passed to the House of Austria and Emperor Maximilian I. It may therefore be said that our knowledge of the coexistence between the Jews and Christians of Regensburg at the beginning of the 16th century is based on a large number of files. The contents of all these complaints and writs convey a very graphic picture of the living conditions of the Jews of Regensburg, as well as the hostility directed against them. In my presentation, I will focus on two themes: physical violence against Jews and limitations on the use of the Jewish cemetery until its destruction in 1519. In short, this could be described as violence against Jews, living and dead alike. References to physical violence against Jews can be found around 1500, especially in complaints to the city, the Duke and the Emperor, while no such indications are to be found in the statements of claim in the Innsbruck proceedings. It should not, however, be assumed that no such attacks against Jews happened during the years before the expulsion. There are probably two reasons why these were not mentioned in the proceedings. On the one hand, the Regensburg municipal plaintiff did its level best to call into question all of the Jews' rights and privileges. These ranged from the claim that the Jews never had such rights up to the claim that the privileges which they presented were complete forgeries. On the other hand, the possibility of expulsion became ever more likely, as not only the city but also the guilds presented this as an option for an ad hoc improvement in the city's catastrophic economic situation. Against this background, it is understandable why the Jewish plaintiff did not mention physical attacks and focused on the legal issues, hoping that a positive ruling would not only prevent the expulsion, but would also place Jewish life in Regensburg on a legal footing that would protect them from further attacks. As to the complaints of physical violence, it is striking that the Jews declared physical violence as a way to prevent Jews from making a reliable livelihood. Half a year after a more general call for help to the city, I quote, "They strike us, they beat us, they batter us, so that we can be sure neither of body nor of life," end of quote, becomes a complaint to the Duke. Furthermore, we are shamefully treated, having things thrown at us, and we are so severely beaten that we cannot care for our daily life. Item, as soon as we leave the Jewish quarter for food, we have things thrown at us, and we are beaten to an inch of our lives, accompanied by invective, beatings, and shrieks. End of quote. A few years later, the situation of the Jews of Regensburg was even more disastrous, since the violence was now directed not only against them, but also against those Christians who were supposed to protect them. So, in 1502, they once again appealed to the Duke. Item, a Christian wanted to throw a Jew who wanted to draw water into the Danube, in the presence of a Stadtknecht, constable. The Stadtknecht prevented this act, whereupon the mayor threw the Stadtknecht into jail. And as a result, the Stadtknecht are no longer prepared to help us. End of quote. Some high-ranking individuals and people who held municipal office even took part themselves in violent acts, as is reflected in a complaint to the Duke. In many of these attacks, those involved include Herr Wolf von Frauenberg, Herr Linhard von Gumpenberg, as well as 3 warned messengers. End of quote. In 1506, Wolf von Frauenberg was one of the 4 barons who represented the highest nobility in Bavarian parliament, while Sir Linhard von Gumpenberg occupied the position of guardian of Dingolfing, a city in Lower Bavaria. The extreme violence of the attacks on Jews is also conveyed by provisions in the Jewish regulation proposed in 1500 by Dr. Heinrich Hayden, an imperial commissioner. At the very beginning, the wording is as follows. First of all, the mayor and the council should announce publicly that no individual shall abuse or distress a Jew, not with shouts, blows, or insults, on pain of prison, where each and everyone who has infringed the above provision shall be locked up for a night. If a youth infringes the regulation, the mayor and council shall order the father or lord of this self-same youth to punish the youth to ensure that this does not happen again. End of quote. Clearly, minors were already taking part in the verbal abuse. A further provision, which is however not present in every source of the planned regulation on the Jews, explicitly added physical violence as a punishable offense. Quote, and the Reichshauptmann, the mayor, and the council are to determine a punishment for instances where somebody pushes or beats a Jew. If the Jew reports this to the Reichshauptmann or mayor, depending on the type and extent of the abuse, a fine and penalty shall be imposed at the discretion of the Reichshauptmann, the mayor, and the council. End of quote. Compared with the first part, it is not only remarkable that in addition to the mayor and council, reference is made to the imperial Reichshauptmann. In addition, there is no specific sentence laid down. Even though this Jewish regulation did not come into force, here too it can be seen that not only physical violence but also psychological abuse was an everyday feature on Jews' lives. Moreover, the Jews' complaints make it clear that these attacks were definitely intended not only to humiliate or abuse the Jews of Regensburg. Rather, the goal was to make it increasingly difficult to them to continue to live in the city, so that finally they would be forced to migrate. Backing this up, one complaint said, I quote, by means of such attacks, they wish to drive us out of here. End of quote. The Jewish cemetery is my next point. The violence and efforts to drive Jews out of the city were directed not just against living Jews. The Jewish cemetery and hence the dead were also targeted. The Jewish cemetery, as opposed to the physical and psychological violence against Jews, was also mentioned in the suits of 1516 to 1519. The Regensburg cemetery was close to the St. Emmerer monastery in the south of the city and was one of the largest and most important in the empire. Its catchment area was far more extensive than the borders of Regensburg. The reports of the 1519 expulsion of the Jews indicate that there were more than 4,000 gravestones in the cemetery, and I think this is much, much more than, for example, in Worms. 4,000 is, in Worms we have like 1,000 something, and so big cemeteries. Even before the Jews were expelled, the cemetery was a thorn in the flesh not only of the city notables, but also, for example, of the Hanseatic League. Basically, the complaints and statements of claim deal with two topics. Firstly, the Jews of Regensburg are to be prohibited from burying foreign Jews in the cemetery. In 1516, the Hanseatic League of Regensburg proposed a Jewish regulation in connection with a voluminous statement of claim which the city submitted in the Innsbruck proceedings. The passage in question reads as follows, I quote, "Furthermore, the local Jewish community shall be prohibited from bringing into the city any foreign, external, visibly sick or dead Jew or Jewesses, nor their children, nor to bury them in the cemetery without the agreement of the Honorable Council. If this provision is infringed, the Jewish community shall be required without mercy to pay the Honorable Council 50 Rhenish guilders per person." End of quote. The penalty of 50 guilders was extremely high. The amount corresponded to a quarter of the tax which the Jewish community was required to pay annually to the Duke of Lower Bavaria and after his death to Emperor Maximilian I. With one exception, there is no penalty of this magnitude for any of the 55 points that made up the Jewish regulations proposed by the Hanseatic League. The other exception, there also 50 Rhenish guilders had to be paid was for the pledges or liturgical artifacts, especially chalices, for which it was also 50 guilders. In addition, I quote here, it said for this regulation, "Every gatekeeper or anyone else who hears about this and reports it shall always receive 2 Rhenish guilders." End of quote. So the Hanseatic League thus selected informers who would count on a generous reward for their services. A second restriction also implemented concerned funeral processions to the cemetery. The Jews of Regensburg were forced to employ a Stadtknecht, a constable, and to pay him for accompanying the funeral cortege to the cemetery. I quote. "Item, we are also not allowed to carry a deceased person out of the city without the presence of a constable who must be paid for this." End of quote. The justification for the requirement that a cortege be accompanied was given as protecting the Jews in the procession. In light of their text referred to above, this rule may not have been entirely unfounded. However, the question is whether the constable could in fact actually prevent these attacks. In the summer of 1518, about 6 months before the expulsion, the representative of the Jewish plaintiffs in the Innsbruck trial noted that the Jews would only employ the constable because their freedoms were not respected. Moreover, as the authorized representative emphasized, I quote, "However, the constable does not provide much assistance." End of quote. In conclusion, the picture we have is that as soon as the Jews of Regensburg left the Jewish quarter, they were subjected to physical and psychological attacks, which might even be made against a funeral procession. Violence was motivated not only by the prospect of physical abuse, but also by efforts to expel the Jews from the city in the long term. These efforts were supported by the Hanseatic League and by some of the city's leading figures. The expulsion of the Jews of Regensburg finally began on February 21st in 1519, with the destruction of the synagogue, as well as plundering of destroying of the Jewish community. Both the expulsion and the destruction of the cemetery were accompanied by massive attacks of violence. These attacks of destruction are referred to a few weeks after the expulsion in a supplication by the Jews to the Innsbruck government, which was still responsible as an arbitral court, and I quote, "And over and beyond this, the aforementioned Reichshauptmann, the mayor and council, have even dared to raze to the ground our synagogue, houses and the cemetery, and to confiscate the gravestones, which are worth thousands of guilders, and to confiscate property from the praiseworthy house of Austria and your grace, and also to dig up the corpses, to drag them about, to stab and smash them, contrary to all laws in nature." End of quote. In addition to the violence against the Jews during the expulsion, at the end of this supplication, reference is made to the inordinately excessive violation and sacrilege of the corpses at the Jewish cemetery. It is striking that in this connection the responsibility for this, as perceived from the point of view of the Jews of Regensburg, lay solely with those responsible for the city. The wording in the supplication is extremely forceful. I quote, "The community is not to blame for this, because it did not wish to do anything to any Jew, and it provided him with good shield and protection. And they also wept some tears with us in the wake of this outrageous and vicious treatment." End of quote. Thank you very much.
I suggest you stay here at the panel, and why don't you join us as well? We have quite a bit of time for discussion, so thank you all for being so punctual and so to the point and so enlightening. We will take questions.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting. I have, let's see, first Astrid ask some questions. Could you expand a bit more about the type of source you have? The city Archiv document, who wrote it down, who collected it, from what year does it start till what year? Was the Augustine Fowler who did it? Was it always in German? Do you have some entries in other languages? You see, this relates to my talk later. So.
And mainly, do we have Hebrew sources too?
Most of the sources I use are of the they're in the State Archive in Bavarian State Archive in Munich, and it's the part I took the sources out of it is Reichsstadt Regensburg Urkunden, and there are there are thousands of documents and sources in this part, and they're mostly sorry.
No, these are municipally they wrote down the entries of sell and buy and.
No, the seller and the buyer go to the municipal council and say, please write it down, so that we have a
legal registry.
Yes.
Municipal one.
But there are also letters and other types of sources. In my time, the late Middle Ages, it's mostly late medieval German or sometimes a bit later. But there are also Latin sources, and sometimes we have Hebrew, or we have Hebrew
signatures.
Yeah, or some little notes in Hebrew, and they were collected by the
by the lay society, municipal, in the Rathaus, or by the Pfarre, by the monks?
No, not the monks, the municipal council. But there are also other types of parts of Regensburg sources. So we have the Gemeindesnachlass. Yeah, it's he's a very important person because he was the latest.
He was responsible for the archive of Regensburg in the 19th century, and he was the last person who saw all the sources. And a lot of sources are now lost.
And he edited.
He put together all the sources, and also he made copies of charters and all kind of stuff. So in the end, what we have is a lot of sources, but sometimes it's difficult to know if the copy is made, for example, if the copy is made correctly or something. So there are problems also with it.
For example, just
But he didn't edit all the sources. He collected them in order to write his chronicle. And nowadays they're in, I think, 52 big boxes without any order, but a rough chronological order.
but some of them are original.
Yeah.
And they put out what is the charters. So Urkunden.
Yes.
The original,
yeah.
chart.
So, for example, when you have this David Yud, so David Yud continues sell or buy, I don't remember what it was exactly. Was this registered by the municipally archive, or is this an original document that they preserved with this source? Or we can't tell. Maybe we can't tell.
It's difficult because everything is an original document. But you have to go to the municipal council, so there is the scribe, and he scribes it, and it's the one who buys and the one who sells can also get a copy, but another copy is at the archives of the municipal council.
Sorry. It's an excellent question because and we deal a lot of with this problem because of course we do not know where the sources come from sometimes, and sometimes the ways are very strange and very different. For example, for my work, I've found a lot of sources in the Tyrolean archive in Innsbruck, and now in my research recently, right now I found that I can show the way of some of these sources. And I had you need luck sometimes to show it, but yes, it's difficult sometimes. You cannot say always.
Any more questions? Cordelia?
Yes, thank you all. I have a very broad and pretty evil question, which comes out of pure envy of a person working in an area with much less documentation. Your project is called Regensburg, a case study. Could you say anything about particular points of significance of your results for other areas with much less documentation, and about what you find out about the Jewish quarter in Regensburg? How is it significant for Jewish quarters in Ashkenaz in general?
Of course, it's a very broad question, but I try to answer at least regarding my topic. As mentioned before, I try to not only look at the ritual murder accusation of Regensburg, but also other accusations in Southern Germany. And the exceptional situation in Regensburg is that actually the accusation doesn't work out. There's no conviction, the Jews weren't expelled, not killed or anything. So what I try to find out is whether the situation in Regensburg was special. If it was so, why? Whether it can be compared to other situations, whether maybe it was not as special as it seems at the first look. So I really try to find is a new look at the assumed very, very bad situation at the end of 15th century in terms of Jewish-Christian relations, but also combining it with the insight on the Jewish relations, how they affect actual ritual murder accusation as well as the inner Jewish developments. So it's kind of trying to use this broad material in order to get a very detailed look on how it works, because there are so many documents.
And also, as you know, the expulsion of Regensburg from Regensburg in 1519 was very late, so one of the latest expulsions which happened. So people or Jews from other cities or other places came to Regensburg, and we are very careful about the names, for example, looking for a lot of names. So this is one part to answer your question, that we can know more about the history of other places. And yeah, also I think for Regensburg, what is very, this is my in my thesis, what is very special about Regensburg is that they had this legal legal discussion before the expulsion. So they went to Innsbruck, they went to the court, and they fighted for their rights for years. I mean, from 16 on, and even after the expulsion, the court decided that it was not correct, this expulsion, and that the Jews should have the right to come back. And so this is very special in some way. You can say, so okay, maybe, but I think you can think about why it did not happen in Nuremberg, for example, in 1599, and other places.
You can compare, of course, you can compare the cities and the location of the Jewish quarters. As I'm at the beginning of the research regarding the topography of the Jewish quarter in Regensburg, I, at this point, cannot say a lot about the comparison to other quarters. But as I said, it's a very, the synagogue is, for example, at a really between the Jewish quarter and the Christians, because there is the main street. Also, it was the commercial street, the most important commercial street in ancient Roman times, and it's also the most important commercial street at the time of the late medieval Regensburg Jewish quarter. And you don't have Jewish houses around the synagogue. So here you have the edge, and there you have a row of houses, and there is the synagogue. And you don't have the synagogue in the center of the quarter, so that's a really important thing in Regensburg.
May I just, since we're talking about the synagogue for a minute, if you'll allow me, my prerogative is, there is an alleged woodcut by Altdorfer, not the two very famous ones showing the synagogue interior and the entrance to the synagogue, the foyer, but there is another one that I found on the internet, which really intrigues me, but it actually illustrates what you've just said, and that is a fabulous structure right next to the church, and there's a big square actually encompassing those two magnificent edifices. Is that correct? Is that woodcut probably not by Altdorfer? Is that telling us a true story? Did the two structures really stand in vicinity, in such close proximity to one another, and did the synagogue really look as magnificent as allegedly it was?
As I didn't work so much on the synagogue, I can't tell how it. Of course, I can't tell how it looked like in the late medieval Regensburg, but it's really the opposite. You only have to go a few steps to the Augustinian monastery. It's about 10 or 15 steps, and it's really in the vicinity. And what's really interesting about the situation of the synagogue in the archaeological excavations is that before it was assumed that the synagogue was below the new parish church, Neue Pfarrkirche, and the excavations brought to light that the synagogue was even at this spot as it is now, and there has been another older synagogue been found with the archaeological excavations.
I think this is an outstanding point for us all to bear in mind. Two fantastic, important buildings standing one next to another in one of the most important parts of the city. But you wanted to ask. Okay.
have two questions. One, a minor question to you, Astrid, and the other, a general to the three of you that you really don't have to answer. The first question is how are the documents that of selling and buying apartments and houses, are they uniform? Is there any personal writing that can teach us something beyond the question of acquisition and location? That's the first question. The other question is more general, as I said. When we deal with the 12th, 13th century, there used to be a big debate about the judicial definition of the Jewish community as a collegium, and how was the community perceived judicially in the eyes of the law? And the question was premature relating to the 12th and 13th century because the idea of collegium was not that developed. But when we reach the 15th and 16th century, Roman law developed a lot, and I'm wondering if any of you touched the question of the judicial definition and if they were perceived as one unity judicially.
The sources about the house sales, or there are not only house sales, but there are other documents who contain information about the location of houses. But the house sale documents always start with the same expression, I, the so-and-so, my wife and heirs declare to all those, blah blah blah. And there is a form, but you also you have depending on the one who sells or buys the house, you have other expressions, or you have information about the location of the house, or the payment, and of course modalities of payment. So he had already given us half of the sum he should have paid, and so. But normally it's a formula here.
And I can try to answer your question maybe in terms of the Riedler-Pohlers accusation, where the Jewish community is perceived as a juridical entity in most cases. So, for example, penalty payments would be given to the whole Jewish community, and the distribution they do by themselves. The so-called Steuerer, the people in the Jewish community responsible for collecting taxes and other payments, were recognized by the municipal authorities as such. There was also, at least till the 1470, the so-called Judengericht, which allowed the Jews to have a court in the Judenschule, the Schulhof. But in most cases, it's rather a mixture. For example, when the Jewish community, when the house arrest was ended, the Jewish community didn't have to sign a document as a community, but every household had to sign for itself.
Professor Polka? Oh, I'm sorry.
No.
Did you? Professor Polka.
It's exciting to see this new flowering. I'm very grateful to see this new flowering of studies on the Jewish community of Regensburg after so many years of stagnation. What I would like to ask you is, how do you see today, if you have, so you are the only one to see the work of Raphael Strauss. I'm very fond of this personality. It's a very interesting personality, and a tragic personality too, a scion of a famous Jewish Orthodox family of Germany, the Strauss in Jerusalem, the buildings in the So how would you see, how would you evaluate today his work on Regensburg, his Urkunden und Aktenstücke?
think what Raphael Strauss did is just enormous, enormous work he did, and of course we are very happy about his work. It's the basic, it's the fundament which we work on, but the problem a little bit with Strauss is that most of the case, or in many cases, he just gave a summary of a source. And if you look at, for example, what we were talking about, the Gmeinersnachlass, which this man in the 19th century collected, and you compare Strauss with the original or maybe even the copy of something, then you will find out that sometimes Strauss skipped a lot of things, which we now find very important, for example. Of course, he could not do all because it was too much, but I think it is very important to look at all sources we have. It's not enough to have a look just at Strauss. I think.
Maybe I can give an example to illustrate what Veronika just said. For example, Strauss would give the accounts of the Regensburg city council members who were at the imperial court in order to make the case of the city council regarding the Richter murder accusation. But so he would give the little part of the whole account, maybe 3 pages. He'd give a little piece which is connected to the Jews. What he left out, for example, is all the trouble the city council had with their members at the imperial court, who would always ask for more money, and the city council would tell them they don't have that much money, and they try to get the case done as quickly as possible because they run out of money, which is actually a very important aspect in terms of why the Richter murder trial went the way it did. But you can't see it from Strauss because he was not really interested in the inner Christian dealings of the city council.
And also very interesting, if you look at the suits, the court in Innsbruck, what Strauss skipped, for example, was also all kind of religious words, or which I think it's very interesting that he, I don't know, maybe it's he thought that it's not important, or I don't know, but I think therefore you should have a look at this again and look at Strauss. And also very important that Strauss, and I think this is definitely not his fault, there are a couple of charters which he did not had, which I don't know, and which now can be found in the archive, which are extremely important. So these are just missing in his edition.
I'm sorry, we have to conclude. We have a short break. We convene again at noon. But I want to thank the 3 lecturers for fantastic presentation, and I think for fantastic example of collaboration. I mean, it just worked out and flowed so beautifully between all 3 of you. And it's a model for us all to take and remember. Thank you so much.